So what does it mean to be net zero or on a journey to being net zero? I must admit that I was quite confused by this and never really understood the difference between being carbon neutral or net zero. But now from what I understand, net zero is a step further than carbon neutral. So carbon neutral is about balancing out your emissions and offsetting emissions, whereas when you're on a journey to net zero, you're setting yourself really rigorous targets to reduce your emissions. That's the key thing. You need to reduce your emissions as much as possible and set yourself a target around that. So, for example, reducing your emissions by 50% by 2030. And then at the end of this process, when you've reduced your emissions as much as possible, any emissions that are left, which are unavoidable emissions, they then need to be offset. But offset in a different way. They need to be offset by removing the carbon from the atmosphere through carbon sequestration. And this can be man-made or naturally, but that's the type of offset that's required. So with net zero and on your journey to net zero is really about reducing your emissions as much as possible.
Carbon neutral might be one of the more familiar climate action terms because many companies talk about the fact that they've achieved carbon neutral status, and it's a relatively easy step to achieve on your journey to net zero. Being carbon neutral means balancing your carbon emissions by offsetting an equivalent amount of carbon as is being produced. So you can offset in a number of ways: planting trees, buying carbon credits, or maybe investing in renewable energy solutions. The thing is, though, that being a carbon neutral business doesn't always mean that you're working to reduce your carbon emissions.
Climate change is the long-term change in average weather patterns globally. So putting that simply, the climate is the average of all the daily weather that's happened in the time frame being measured, which is usually over long periods of time, so centuries and decades. Long-term trends are then analysed to see how the climate is changing, and it's been found that the climate is getting warmer and getting hotter, which is known as global warming. And this is due to mostly human activity factors, but also natural forces. And global warming has been linked to the increase in extreme weather events happening around the world, such as floods and flash flooding and fires.
The term climate crisis describes global warming and climate change, and is often used to describe the negative impact that global warming is having on the planet and to encourage businesses and individuals to make urgent changes.
Your carbon footprint is the amount of greenhouse gases that you're generating in a year. A greenhouse gas is something like carbon dioxide or methane, and the way that it's expressed is in equivalent tonnes of carbon dioxide every year. And everybody has a personal footprint. You may have already heard about that or measured your own, but your business has one as well. And the things that contribute to your carbon footprint and cause you to generate those greenhouse gases is anything from the waste you produce, how you get rid of it, the transport that your staff are using if they're going to the workplace, the electricity you're generating, fuel you're using, and any emissions.
For me, carbon negative and carbon positive are one of the most contradictory terms, as they sound as if they should be totally different to one another, but they're actually the same thing. Both phrases mean a business is removing more carbon from the atmosphere than it's actually producing. So I remember it by thinking carbon negative is taking away carbon, which puts you in a carbon positive place.
So decarbonisation literally means the removal and reduction of carbon from the atmosphere, but this term is used in referring to a country's economy reducing the amount of carbon that's emitted across all of its active industries. So an example of an active industry which has really contributed to decarbonisation is the energy sector, because of the growth in the use of renewable energy. So two examples of renewable energy are solar panels and wind farms. Because of the growth of renewable energies, it's meant that there's been a decreased reliance in the use of fossil fuels, and renewable energy emits absolutely nowhere near as much carbon as fossil fuels.
Sequestration. If you're like me, you'll have struggled to even say the word to start with, but it's actually a pretty simple concept. It's all about taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it elsewhere. So there's natural ways that you can do this, such as reforestation, or areas that are in development artificially, such as carbon capture and storage technologies. Scopes 1, 2 and 3. I guess these are kind of some of the key terms you've been hearing about more than anything. And you'll be pleased to know that scopes 1 and 2 are relatively simple. Scope 1 is the carbon that is produced closest to your business and normally combusted on site. And so that mainly covers gas and company-owned cars. And scope 2 is the carbon that comes into your business but is combusted elsewhere. So that's mainly electricity. Scope 3 is where it gets a little bit more complicated. It's all the external sources of carbon that are relevant to your business. So that covers your entire supply and value chain. There's actually 15 categories that you need to consider, but they're split into two key areas. The first is upstream. So that's all the resources coming into your business, whether that's raw materials for the creation of your products, the business travel undertaken by your employees, or employees actually working from home. And then there's downstream, and that's what happens to the goods and services once they leave your business. And that covers all the carbon generated by their distribution to customers or interim suppliers, or how they're processed at the end of their life or usage, or your investments.
You'll hear a lot about the term measuring your baseline. So baseline measurement and reporting is the process needed to establish your starting point from which your reduction targets can be set and your carbon reduction measured.
So materiality is a concept that defines what issues are most important to you as a business. Quite often you'll hear big businesses talk about materiality assessments, where they interview stakeholders and they look at key issues and trends and work out what are the most material issues to them as a business. I think this can be quite complicated for small businesses, so I like to think about it as just relevant issues. So in the context of climate change, when looking at materiality, you're looking at what emissions are most relevant to you as a business. What are your emission hotspots? Where can you have the most impact and where can you make reductions? So when thinking about materiality, think about relevance, think about those most relevant emissions and where you can have the greatest impact.